Well, welcome, everybody. Come in, make yourself at home, pull up a chair, grab yourself a drink. It's 6 o'clock on Wednesday, so here I am again. I'm Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Regulars to the IEA London YouTube channel will know that this is usually when we broadcast Live with Littlewood, but there's no Live with Littlewood tonight. Instead, we have a very special episode of our In Conversation series. Grab yourself a drink. I'm joined by, this evening, a guest who I think ticks all of the boxes that we look for in the sort of people we sit down and have a conversation with. I sit down and have a discussion with somebody who's a politician or a businessman or a thought leader or an all-round newsmaker. And I ask them what they think of the world today, what they think of the world around them. And so this evening, I'm going to be sitting down and ever so gently grilling the brand new leader of Reform UK, Richard Tice. Probably ticks all of those boxes: politician, businessman, thought leader, and newsmaker. So a very good evening to you, Richard. It's lovely to have you with us. I'll let you say good evening to people in just a moment. But what I'd like to do is just to run through all of the boring housekeeping rules before we get to Richard. This is actually going on 2 different platforms at the moment. Some people are watching us and joining us on Zoom. Others are watching us live as we stream on YouTube. If you want to ask a question on the Zoom side, please don't put it in the chat box. Please put it in the Q&A box. Go to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen and put your question in there. If you're too shy to ask a question yourself, you can peruse the questions there and give a thumbs up tick to the questions you particularly like. And being a democratic sort of guy, I will probably be putting the questions to Richard that have risen to the top of the Premier League of questions. So put your questions in there. Any technical issues or problems, put those in the chat box on Zoom. Similarly on YouTube, if you're watching us on YouTube, I'm going to try and keep half an eye on the live chat there. If you've got a great question, I'll try and put it to our speaker. So put that in the live chat and I'll do what I can to dip in and out of the YouTube chat as well. So that's all the housekeeping stuff. If you're watching us on YouTube and are liking what you're seeing, please hit the thumbs up button. If you're not yet a subscriber to IEA London, then make sure that you hit subscribe and the notification bell to keep up to date with all of our broadcasts, which are practically daily. That's the boring stuff out of the way. Let me introduce tonight's very special guest. Richard Tice is a businessman and politician who for the last 18 days has been the leader of Reform UK, the heir of the Brexit Party, which had such an impact at the 2019 European parliamentary elections, topping the poll and leapfrogging the established parties to get first place in the vote share. Before he entered the world of politics by setting up the pro-Brexit campaign group Leave.EU in 2015, Richard worked in the property industry, and over his career, he was the CEO of 3 different businesses in that sector. He co-founded the Brexit Party, was elected at the top of the list in the east of England, and served from the 2019 European parliamentary elections until he and all of the rest of the British MPs walked out when Brexit was finally achieved. Despite all of these virtues, I should warn everybody at home that Richard is not without his vices and his faults, and I regret to inform you that he is, in fact, a fan of Liverpool Football Club. But enough said about that, and I'll try not to mention that again. Richard, lovely to have you with us. Good evening. How are you keeping, my friend?
Mark, good evening. Fantastic. Thank you for that kind introduction. Some of that feels like a lifetime ago, but lots happened in the last couple of years.
That's right. That's right. You know, decades can pass in mere weeks on occasions. Look, there's a hell of a lot for us to get through, Richard. The sort of big news from Reform UK HQ in the past month, apart from your deliberations about the Hartlepool by-election, has been the announcement of your economic policies, which seem to be focused on, you're saying the principle is lower taxes, simpler taxes equals higher growth. Obviously, for those of us of a free market persuasion, that sounds like it should be music to my ears, but sketch out, without getting into all of the weeds and the detail, what your party's basic approach is to taxation. What's wrong with the present system, and what's your recipe for fixing it?
Great, thank you very much. Well, what I'm first going to ask listeners and viewers to think about it, think Harry Potter. Some of you may have watched all the films, some of you may have read all the books. Think of the combined collection of all Harry Potter books, and then multiply that number of pages by 5. You get to about 20,000 pages. That is the size of the tax code in the UK. It's the longest in the world. It's probably the most complicated in the world. It's so long the HMRC don't know within 1,000 pages how long it is. And interestingly, it's over 60 times longer than what's accepted as the most efficient tax code in the world in Hong Kong at a mere 300 pages. And the thing is that actually, keep things simple. And our message is, and it's clearly demonstrated around the world, that if you have low taxes, simple taxes, then your economy will grow faster. And if it grows faster, what follows from that? Better wages, particularly for the least well off, the lowest paid, and you generate much higher tax revenues to invest wherever you want in your public services over the medium term. And growth really, really matters. There are almost no examples of high tax, high growth economies around the world. But there are plenty of good examples of low tax, high growth. And I'll give you a couple that I refer to quite a bit, which is Australia, Singapore, and the US. And they have a significantly lower overall tax take than the UK. And guess what, folks? Yes, they have a significantly higher annual compound growth. And the reason it matters, take Australia, Commonwealth country, great nation. If we had matched Australia's growth over the last 15 years, then our annual tax take, the tax revenues from the UK, would be £150 billion every year higher. That's like me giving you another NHS budget tomorrow. I mean, that's really big, really significant. And so when you get, all different vested interest groups, lobbying groups asking for more money here, there, and there, whether it's more soldiers, more ships, more aeroplanes, more hospital beds, more doctors, more nurses' pay, all of this stuff could be afforded if we grow much faster. And so the whole basis of our philosophy is that we are now actually, unbelievably, we're the only party now standing on a philosophical belief that low taxes, simple taxes will generate higher growth, and that will mean that we've got much more choices to be the best in everything. If we want the best healthcare system, the best military, the best policing, let's be ambitious, but the only way you can be ambitious is you've got to have more tax revenues, you've got to generate more tax revenues, and you do that by having higher growth.
So you're essentially, Richard, what you're saying here is a belief in support for the Laffer curve. You're saying, at least over a period of time, I guess it might not happen on day one, but if you lower the tax burden in aggregate, you'll encourage enterprise and employment, and you'll reap the harvest, if not in week one or even year one necessarily, further down the line. And it's a kind of win-win then. Taxes go down, but public spending can go up. That's your proposal,
Correct.
Right?
Absolutely. And the thing is, just look at where we are now. The Chancellor's budget the other week, he basically confirmed that what we've got to look forward to is the highest tax take this country's had for 70 years, at about 35% of the overall size of our economy every year. The other thing we've got to look forward to is the lowest medium-term growth for 60 years. So it's a pretty gloomy, unambitious picture where actually you really can't say, what's the difference between what I now call them the con-socialists, because what's the difference between the current government's economic philosophy and the Labour Party? And you know that that's true because you had the Shadow Chancellor asking a Tory Chancellor to delay tax rises. Mm-hmm. Pretty extraordinary situation. So we've moved into the low tax, high growth ground that's been completely vacated by the Tory party. And it's really, really dangerous because once you go down that path, it's incredibly difficult. It takes massive resolve to turn around the super tanker and to head towards a path of higher growth and lower taxes. And the real point here is, I have a philosophy and a simple belief that the individual or the small business owner will always spend £1 in their pocket smarter, more wisely than the bowler-hatted civil servant will.
So, but my job's to challenge you here, Richard, right? I mean, obviously, you're in the field of electoral politics. You've got to think of the art of the possible. I'm in the field of think tanks. My job is to think the unthinkable. So I guess people who work for think tanks, we're the sort of people who simply won't take yes for an answer, right? There's nothing you can do to satisfy the IEA. We'll always want you to go further and faster. But I'm wondering, when I get into the detail here, whether my challenge to you might be that you've been insufficiently radical. You're suggesting raising the income tax threshold to 20,000 and the 40p band up to 70,000 for sake of argument. You would impose a 3% tax on online businesses. I think in the round, the tax burden would fall under your proposals. But if you really wanted to go Singapore on Thames, you should go way, way further, shouldn't you? I mean, the fastest growing economies in the world have a tax take of around about 20 or 25% of GDP. Singapore's closer to that level than Australia and America. We're well into the 30s. I mean, shouldn't we actually be trying to get tax revenues and government spending down far more than your opening gambit?
Look, I mean, broadly right. The first thing we have to do, and it's extraordinary, there is no debate amongst politicians, no debate amongst the mainstream media, actually, how much of a stimulus, in order to go for that growth, how much can we as a nation afford by way of national debt? And therefore, in a sense, the Tory party is sort of panicked because our national debt has hit about 100%, and they want to try and repay some of that. Most people are unaware that in the emergency period between the two world wars, we had, for 35 years, the size of our national debt relative to the size of our economy was 150+% for 35 years on the trot. So in reality, and that's when interest rates were somewhat higher than where they are now. So in reality, actually, we can afford a higher level of debt as long as we invest it smartly and wisely. And so most people wouldn't be aware, for example, you touched quite rightly, Mark, on Singapore. Singapore's debt as a relative to the size of their economy, even though they're growing at 4 or 5% a year, their size of their debt is about 130%, significantly higher than the UK. Why? Because they keep investing in the best facilities, the best infrastructure. Look at the US. The US's debt is about 20% higher than ours. They consistently grow faster than the UK. So we have to have that debate first and say, what level of debt could we actually afford? Now, our stimulus plan, you said we're not ambitious enough, and in a way, I sort of accept your criticism, but it's pretty ambitious to say to the nation, actually, we're going to free up 6 million of the lowest paid in society, the least well off, from paying any income tax whatsoever. Now, don't forget, of course, they're still paying national insurance, so they're still contributing, but that's really, really significant. And the money that they say, that's almost £30 a week in their pockets, which is a material difference. So this benefits the least well off the most, and £30 a week helps pay food bills, utility bills, rent or mortgage. That's really material. We free up over 1 million businesses, Mark, from paying any corporation tax whatsoever, whether you're self-employed, small business, by raising the threshold from 0 up to 100 grand, which means you can invest in software and equipment, in more jobs. And so you get this massive multiplier effect. And we think this stimulus plan would mean that you'd get faster growth of about 1.25% compound per annum.
Okay, well, let me just pick away at some of this. Firstly, I mean, the IEA, I have to say, people at the IEA are divided on this point, but some at the IEA argue that taking people out of tax altogether is something of a moral hazard. The IFS already calculates that 42% of adults pay no income tax at all. So they don't have skin in the game, right? And then suddenly the spending decisions become, well, it can all be paid for by the millionaires and the billionaires. Of course, there aren't enough millionaires and billionaires. It's also the affluent middle class. But is there any concern that people don't have skin in the game? And, you know, if you want to spend much more, then shouldn't businesses and individuals and the average worker have to trade that off against their income tax bill in the same way that politicians do? Don't you think there's a danger that we're continually shifting the burden sort of higher and higher up the income and wealth spectrum, almost to the extent of saying, you know, you can have everything for free, we'll get the big companies and the billionaires to pay for it? Isn't that, I mean, don't we want everyone to have a bit of a stake in the system proportionately?
Which is why I said that actually even the lowest paid are still contributing because they're paying national insurance, employees, national insurance. So actually they have got skin in the game. And it's easy to forget, of course, when income tax was first introduced, it was only introduced really for the wealthy. So, and it was then gradually, and remember, it was supposed to be a temporary tax. Here we are 300 years later.
It was to win the Napoleonic Wars.
Sorry,
yes,
200 years.
over.
That's right, yes. And it was introduced for the wealthy. So, you know, people do have a stake. And of course, everybody's paying VAT and paying, you know, tax on fuel and a whole raft of other taxes. You know, part of our plans, apart from freeing up the taxes I've sort of meant, we would actually abolish a raft of taxes, again, that would particularly help the lowest paid, the least well off. And I think the other thing is the reason we can afford to invest more and to free up is it's easy to forget. The Bank of England now essentially owns internally almost 45% of the national debt, almost £1 trillion. And it holds that as sort of relatively short-term gilts. But there's a very easy solution that it could do. It could refinance all of that debt as a long-term 75-year, almost like a war bond. I call it a corona bond. So if you fix it for 75 years, and if you fix an interest rate of just 1/2%, then you remove what people worry about. You know, I know you worry, Mark, about what happens if interest rates go up. Well, if you fix almost half of your national debt for 75 years at just 1/2%, you know, that is smart business. And that's what should be done. You remove the refinance risk. And it's also important to remind everybody, you know, the truth is sovereign nations don't have to repay your national debt. You have to be able to refinance it. And you have to be able to convince the credit markets you can pay the interest. Well, if when interest rates are very low, you've refinanced it into the very, very long term, then you've dealt with a huge amount of that risk. And that's why you can keep investing. As long as, I completely get the point, that we've got to spend the money wisely. Well, the best way to spend the money wisely is actually to give it back to the people. Because as I said at the beginning, the people will always spend £1 in their pocket more wisely than some Whitehall civil servant.
Okay, but then let me point to another underlying problem. We were obviously running deficits anyway prior to the coronavirus pandemic. It's now just gone through the roof, but we haven't had a balanced budget since 2001, I think was the last time that the Chancellor spent less than he brought in taxes. But to some degree, this isn't really the problem. The problem are the underlying liabilities, right? If you get a massive one-off shock to the system, be that the pandemic, be that even the Second World War, you can cope with that and rebuild. But that becomes an awful lot harder if you have made endless promises which are going to chew up huge unfunded, you know, liabilities down the line. We have a triple lock state pension. The pension age has not been increasing as much as life expectancy. I think when the state pension first came in, it came in at something like the age of 67 and life expectancy was 66. The average person claimed their pension for 2-3 years if you made it that far, something of that nature. So the problem isn't so much what we've got on the credit card. I mean, that is a big enough problem. But the problem is if you look at the liabilities, the promises we've made, pensions, public sector pensions, all of the rest, you're probably looking at more like £6 trillion or more, 5 or 6 times GDP. And this was one of my criticisms with George Osborne as Chancellor. He sort of practiced very short-term austerity. You know, we've got to get the budget deficit down, but was then throwing things into the system which are long-term, unbelievably deleterious to public finance. So the triple lock state pension, I mean, surely that has to go, doesn't it? I mean, that is a colossal liability over the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right. The whole pensions and savings system that we have in the UK is incredibly complicated, and particularly with defined benefit schemes, that is the case. It reinforces the need to have higher growth so that you can deal with that. We're going to be coming out with some detailed proposals how to, again, simplify our pension system and to reform it, because it does need reforming. It's too complicated. Most people don't understand it. And the reality is, when you don't understand something, that means that someone else is probably ripping you off somewhere in the system. So we need to massively simplify it. And again, I'm actually going to use Australia as an example. They have a much simpler, smarter, more effective saving system. And so we're very focused on that. And that's something we'll be looking at. But those future liabilities just reinforce why we've got to become a nation of high growth. Otherwise, it becomes ever harder, as you quite rightly worry. And all of a sudden, 35% of tax take becomes 35.5 and 36. You've got to turn the super tank around, and you've got to make it into a sleek, fast-moving speedboat. And that's what we want to do with our economy.
I never thought I'd hear you practically quoting Ursula von der Leyen there, the tanker versus the speedboat. But in your
you copied me. I used it a couple of years ago, actually.
Oh right, she's copying you. You should have patented it. You should have got the IP on that first, Richard. On the tax side, there, are you going to very honestly take it on the chin that to simplify the tax code? I watched your whole launch of your tax plan, and you suggested, which I appreciate, is a kind of an indicative exercise rather than a law. Could we get the tax code down to 500 pages? I think you said.
Yeah.
And obviously, you need to specify the font. You don't want these civil servants to only use font size 2,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
But I get that idea of collapsing it. Are you going to be honest enough to say that's a vast swathe of middle class tax breaks gone? I mean, just anecdotally myself, today I've been sorting out my finances as the end of the tax year approaches. I'm in the top 2% of the population. I'm not a multi-millionaire or anything, but I'm a relatively high earner. It's outrageous, the sort of breaks and schemes I've got. And complicated. How much can I put into my pension and claim tax release for? How much should I put into my ISA? How much should I put into my VCT scheme? It's all of that should just go, shouldn't it?
Correct. It's all so complicated. It's a nightmare, which means you have an army of highly paid accountants and tax advisors, trying to help you legally avoid tax. And the truth is, it's so unproductive. I want 3/4 of that army of people, frankly, to be made redundant and go and do something more creative, more productive, design things, innovate things. That's what we need smart people to do, not to come up with ways to avoid tax. Because what happens if your taxes are too high, then you try and spend your whole life and your advisors trying to avoid them. But we're going to abolish a raft of taxes. We would abolish VAT on domestic fuel, abolish stamp duty on share trading, abolish stamp duty on resi below 750k, abolish the air passenger duty, abolish the apprenticeship levy, abolish business rates for small and medium firms. You talked about the online tax, but then also abolish probably the most hated tax, inheritance tax, below £2 million estates. It's a ludicrous tax. It doesn't raise very much in the scheme of things, and it's a really emotionally tough and sort of grieving tax. And people, there's another army of specialists that try and avoid that. We need to massively simplify things and massively simplify our saving system so that all of this can be focused on, rather than sort of saving tax, have a low, simple tax rate, and then focus on being creative and creating more growth.
Okay, I'm wondering whether you've got, if you like, half the script sorted here, but I wanted to put, I agree with what you've said, that the amount of time that's wasted in gaming the system and in compliance, all of which is rational. I've saved myself thousands of pounds today by effective tax planning, but it wasn't productive work. It just means that my tax liability is a little lower than it otherwise would be. But if that's true, you've implied so far that you really think the tax system is is the particular key thing that determines, fast growth or slow growth, company formation, company growth, employment. Isn't the tax system just a part, albeit a big part, of the overarching regulatory system? So yes, it might well be the case that in Singapore and America, taxes are somewhat lower, but it's also a lot easier to hire and fire people, for sake of argument. Planning restrictions in the United Kingdom are some of the strictest in the world. It's an absolute nightmare to move from a blueprint to actually starting to build something. It's nearly impossible to recalibrate a business from designation A to designation B. None of these things are to do with tax so much, but they're a regulatory burden that means, irrespective of the tax rate being high, medium or low, complex or simple, the sheer amount of red tape in Britain means that we're going around spending all of our time complying rather than producing. No wonder productivity rates are so disappointing, right? Irrespective of tax, there's a whole other part to the story there.
You're absolutely right. We use tax because it is part of the regulatory burden. And that's why actually it is right to be really bullish and say, right, we're not going to have more than 500 pages. And likewise with regulations, you've got to say, actually, why do we need this regulation? And you've got to be really simple about it and say, right, we're not bringing any more. It's literally 1 in, 3 out, or 4 out. And you've got to be ambitious on this stuff. You've got to be really positive. It's a whole different mindset. And yeah, I think we have got, and I worry again, the Conservative government at the moment, they're bringing another raft of regulation. I think it was one of your competitor lobbying groups who said that the Tories have brought in over 400 tax rises net, and how many thousands of regulations. And the business sector at the moment, he wants to penalise directors of companies with the threat of jail if they get their financial statements wrong, and much more complicated audits. And all of this just adds to cost. It reduces productivity, and that is absolutely part of the burden. You've got to go for growth. You've got to cut taxes, cut regulation, and then the other thing you have to cut, of course, is the mountain of wasteful, inefficient government spending. And so we'll be looking at regulations and wasteful government spending as further proposals later in the year after the elections. That's very much part of our agenda, but Rome's not built in a day, Mark.
No, sure. And you've only had 18 days so far. So, but I'd expect you to build Rome within, 20 or 30 days. I'll give you a little bit of slack, but we've got a few questions that have come in, Richard, which I'll dip into now because they're particularly on the tax side. I want to move on to wider issues in a moment. Stuart Ailes asks, you explained that low earners would not pay income tax, but they would still have to pay national insurance. Surely merging these two taxes is one of the more obvious tax simplifications that you could introduce, asks Stuart. What do you say to that? Is that a simplification? And if so, why haven't you embraced it?
It's a really good point. Obviously, income tax is different to national insurance tax. I think it partly comes back, Stuart, to the point that we touched on, which is it's important, when someone looks at their pay slip, if you see that you've paid something to government, you've contributed. And we can have a debate about it. It could be a lot simpler, but I think there is a genuine question about simplifying it and say, well, why does you've got employers, national insurance, and you've got employees? Could we merge those two and simplify them? And the answer is yes, one could. It's another big leap, and I accept the sort of the implicit criticism that maybe we haven't gone quite far enough. But in a sense, what we're doing is we're setting out a range of examples. But I've rarely been accused of not being bullish enough or not being positive enough. So these are all the things that has to be looked at in order to achieve the objective. And that we've come up with a range of simplifying taxes, but there's more. Of course, there's more.
And John May asks, do you intend to align income tax and capital gains tax? If so, where is the incentive to own assets and businesses?
So what we've done actually, we're very focused on the number 20, John. And so I didn't say earlier, but we would be lifting the capital gains tax threshold, again, from about £12,300 up to £20,000. So the same level as income tax, because if you align them and simplify the numbers, and keep them very similar, then again, it comes to this issue of people who are trying to sort of create income gains or capital gains or move between the two. If you keep all the rates level, you end up nearer perhaps the holy nirvana, which is obviously sort of easier to say than do, of almost like a sort of flat tax type system. But that's the direction of travel you have to get to. And then you say, you call it whatever you want, but you're constantly trying to reduce the, it's the lowest paid, that's where we really need to create the greatest increase in net pay. Our proposals, for example, interestingly, the average nurse, a nurse on an average nurse's salary under our income tax proposals would be a net 6% better off than under the government's current proposals.
Just on regulation, before we move on to some wider topics, Richard, Alexander Cully asks, financial services are critical to the British economy. What are Reform UK's plans to turbocharge growth in the UK financial services sector in view of protectionist moves by the EU to undermine it? And just to add an addendum to Alex's question, this is a clear area where regulation, rather specifically than tax, you could argue has throttled productivity. I think it was the IEA's own Philip Booth, if I remember the numbers correctly, I don't have them to hand, who said if you look at the growth in the number of regulators in financial services since 1980 and the number of people who work in financial services, I think it's by 2070 on the present trajectory, there will be more regulators than people working in financial services. Everybody who works in financial services can have their own personal regulator standing over their shoulder for their entire working life. Is that an area where eviscerating, slashing red tape, allowing market incentives to properly operate could actually be what super turbocharges? I mean, the City of London's doing pretty well, but really turbocharges our financial services across the UK.
So Alexandra is quite right, and it's part of what will come out in our proposals on regulations in due course. But during the whole Brexit debate, I've been constantly saying the threat to the City of London was not actually Brexit. The much bigger threat is the regulation, the compliance, this dreadful thing called MiFID II, which came out of the EU, our civil servants gold-plated, is a much, much bigger threat to the City of London, because the city's competition, we all love competition, but the city's competition is not Frankfurt or Paris or Brussels, or indeed Amsterdam. It's actually New York, it's Asia, and they don't have MiFID II. So you've literally got to scrap that. In the insurance world, the solvency regulations I'm told, I'm not an insurance person, I'm told those are really burdensome. So again, you've got to literally put a bonfire through all of this stuff and set yourself some simple, common sense regulations that are going to be effective, that are going to be competitive. And if Hong Kong can do it, then we can. But it is a whole different mindset, and it may require a whole different sense of being. What's interesting though is the really big financial firms, they haven't been complaining about this stuff because actually they can afford the compliance, and it prevents the disruptors from coming in. It's much, much harder for the smaller medium-sized firms to be able to afford that level of compliance. What I really worry, is when I hear bright people saying, well, I'm leaving London, I'm going to New York, or I'm going to Asia, or I'm going to the Middle East, because the regulatory burden is lower, the tax burden is lower, and it all becomes really intertwined. And I think we're at a dangerous tipping point now, a really dangerous tipping point, where what we face is smart capital and smart people leaving the UK, and we also face as big a threat, which is smart capital and smart people not coming to the UK because of these burdens. And that would be devastating for our economic growth.
I think the whole debate about regulation, you make a very good point, Richard, that it's often the big, powerful incumbents are in favour of the status quo. They've got their compliance department. They know how to game the system, or not necessarily game the system, just comply with the system. Yep. And arguing for deregulation is a bit like arguing for the unborn, almost. You can't see the enterprises that haven't got off the ground because of strict regulation. You can just see the enterprises that presently exist and are apparently content with it. I think it's Jacob Rees-Mogg who says if the financial regulatory climate that prevails now had prevailed when he was setting up Somerset Capital, I believe it's called. He thinks he probably couldn't have done it or wouldn't have bothered. It would have been too big a step. So it's a kind of battle for the unborn.
Yeah, well, what's more likely is he would have gone elsewhere and set it up elsewhere. And that's the competitive threat we face. And what worries me is that politicians in Westminster, they're not brave enough to actually tell it as it is. And that's where we're at. You know, I'm hearing more and more people saying, this is just getting ridiculous. The lack of common sense, you know, the increase in taxes, the compliance, and eventually people say, I'm done. And I think we're really close to this, and we have to be incredibly honest with ourselves. You know, and you can tell when, I mean, the self-employed, you know, the excluded, so many millions of them have been literally abandoned during this last year, and you know, it's a disaster, totally unnecessary. And you know, they're risk takers, who are then going to say, well, I'm no longer being rewarded for taking that risk.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move on a bit to the wider picture. Interesting discussion about tax, but obviously you're now the new leader of a kind of rebranded political party with a kind of wider agenda, I guess, and analysis of the problems afflicting the UK and how to solve them. Why bother? You said that you had the Brexit Party year one. Nigel Farage, you know, easily the most well-known and recognised politician associated with you. He's, I think he's still your honorary president, but he's going to pursue a media career rather than a career in electoral politics. I mean, what links together the Reform UK's agenda that makes it a really unique selling proposition? Okay, you've got some interesting ideas on tax. I think you're in favour of electoral reform and the reform of the House of Lords. You've been opposed to lockdowns. Tom Burrows asked in the YouTube chat whether you were opposed them in the first place, or do you just think they've gone too far? Chris Davies asks on the YouTube chat, can you ask Richard how he thinks reform can stand out amongst so many fringe parties? On the Zoom side of the conversation, we've had an anonymous attendee who said, what are Richard's thoughts on Lawrence Fox, who's running for Mayor of London? He set up his own new party. There's now too many parties that begin with the letters RE. You're the Reform Party, he's the Reclaim Party. You know, is there really a gap in the market for this? I mean, especially on things like electoral reform. I mean, you're going to go on demos saying, what do we want? The single transferable vote mechanism for all elections. When do we want it? As soon as the Royal Commission has fully reported. Are these really things that are going to, you know, hit the G-spot of the British electorate? It's Brexit, I could understand, but really salient issue for a large chunk of people, especially after the referendum, people feeling that the democratic will might not be carried out. But isn't this, however worthy, for the birds, really?
Well, the whole point of Brexit was that it created a huge opportunity. And our concern is that actually the Conservatives they've moved to the left. So rather than grasp the opportunity, they're actually going exactly down the wrong road. And the whole point of democracy works best when there's more choice. And if there are other parties who are setting out a different set of proposals. So we put our reforms into three pillars. We've touched tonight on the first one, which is the way the economy is run and managed. Overall, I just believe that our great nation can be so much better run and managed. I'm a businessman. I approach it in a very business-like way. So the economy can be better run and managed. Secondly, our public services. We all know they can be much better run and managed. They can work faster, they can work more efficiently, and they need to treat us like a customer. You know, we pay the bills, folks. We're the customer. So that's the second area, reform. And then the third one you've touched on, I say reforming our institutions that control and govern us so that actually they work for the people. And yes, whether it's the bloated BBC, the cronyism of the unelected House of Lords, yeah, this is stuff for like 200 years ago. It's not for a modern 21st century nation. And yes, the electoral system, we'd like to see proportional representation, because again, you'll get more choice. And with more choice, you get more debate, and then voters will have the ability to come up with more considered and better answers, as opposed to what's a very narrow choice, just two main parties. And you see it in the States. If you've just got a first past the post system, you actually restrict choice, and with less choice, you're going to have less change.
Abolish the monarchy, or does your
concern
about the hereditary principle end with the House of Lords?
It ends with the unelected House of Lords, the second biggest legislative chamber in the world.
I don't remember voting for the House of Windsor.
No, but I'm a royalist. I love it. I think it's a huge part of what attracts people around the world to the UK. It's part of our unique special selling point. So I'm a big fan. On lockdowns, literally from the third week of lockdown, remember folks, 3 weeks to flatten the sombrero was the original expression. Well, I wrote very early that we were in serious danger of the cure being worse than the disease. I think the collateral damage, the quantity of collateral damage, I'm afraid, will manifest itself over coming years. We've always said that we much preferred the Great Barrington Declaration approach to life. And the goalposts keep being moved, and that really worries me. And people are openly talking about, scientists and climate change people saying, well, actually, maybe we should lock down for a month or two every year. That may be a good thing. So, we've got other debates to have. Someone mentioned Lawrence Fox. Lawrence is a great guy. I talk to Lawrence a lot. He's standing for London Mayor on a very clear agenda of reclaiming what's great about London, reopening London, rebooting London. I think choice is good, Mark. It's like competition, isn't it? The more choice, then actually the better a country will be run, and hopefully, therefore, the better it performs.
Yeah, but sometimes there are economies of scale, right? I mean, why aren't you and Lawrence Fox in the same party? It's all a bit People's Front of Judea, isn't it?
No, not at all. We're friendly, far from it. Lawrence is focusing on the London mayoralty. He's not standing anywhere else. We're going to have, give or take, 500 candidates across the whole country in the May elections, from Wales to Scotland to police and crime commissioners, local elections, London, and now Hartlepool. So we've got an infrastructure to be able to. So I suspect we'll have, of all the parties, we'll have amongst the largest number of candidates after the two main parties and probably the Lib Dems.
And it's interesting in politics, and we'll put a link in both chats. Our head of education, Steve Davies, has written about the realignment of British politics. He thinks we're going through a realigning moment, and that Brexit isn't necessarily the cause of it, but is actually a feature of it, if you see what I mean. The sort of things that might make you vote for Party X or Party Y are breaking down. I mean, when I was a boy in elections, essentially the middle class voted Conservative, the working class voted Labour. I mean, a gross generalisation, but a pretty accurate generalisation. That seems to be changing in all sorts of ways. People are voting more around their identity in some size, shape or form, their view perhaps on cultural issues rather than economic issues. Bit of a worry for me running an economics think tank that the big cleavages in political debate and discussion might no longer be about economics. Do you have in your mind though, Richard, if you like, who are your politicians talking this term? Who are your base? I mean, the Conservatives would be able to identify people who are definitely in the true blue camp. Labour would be able to identify people who definitely, can count on them. They've voted, those families have voted Labour since the days of Clement Attlee or Ramsay MacDonald or Keir Hardie. Who are your electorate? Who do you expect this message to go down well with?
I think it's very important to say that actually more and more voters now are lending their vote for an electoral term. And the old days of just voting Labour or just voting Tory, that is literally dying out. I saw it, first of all, campaigning in Hartlepool. By the sixth door, when I had lifelong Labour voters saying, I'm done with Labour, that man Corbyn, they were saying some pretty strong things. And people got, with the Brexit Party, people lent their vote to the Brexit Party for the Europeans. They found that actually that wasn't that scary. And then they were able to lend it in other places. So I think there's much more of a shift. I think, the vast majority of people actually are focused on who's going to stand up for common sense, what actually makes sense. And there's not enough common sense in politics. And I think that, most people, whether you're in a pub or your fish and chip shop or the curry house, they don't talk about this woke nonsense that you hear in the sort of chattering Westminster, village and the sort of the broadcast media. That's just not what normal, real people outside the North and South Circular of London, frankly, talk about. So I think, people, the more choice people have, and look, it'll take a while. We view, this is a building block for us. We've got 3 years until the general election. And so we've got to put the case out there. But if people have more choice and they listen, and I think people are interested in alternatives, then, who knows? And that's how you get better answers. And for us, it's about, we've got to shape and influence the debate, whether it's on the economy, whether it's on the institutions that govern us. If we come up with some interesting, good ideas, then that's how you shape and influence. It's what we did with Brexit, of course. We changed the course of history, and we intend to keep doing that.
But if you were to take Hartlepool, I don't know if you welcome this by-election coming up so early in the new life of your party. Of course, you were the candidate for the Brexit Party in Hartlepool last election. Probably had the Brexit Party won a seat, it probably would have been that one. Certainly, if you'd won 4 or 5 seats, you definitely would have been the one. I think you came a very narrow. Basically, it was a 3-way marginal, if I recall rightly, on the numbers. Does that mean you've got to take this seat now? I mean, the Conservatives are in government. They're supposed to do very badly, incumbent governments in by-elections. The Labour Party MPs had to stand down in a whole maelstrom of difficulty. I mean, if you can't sort of win in a seat like Hartlepool, aren't you, going to be flogging a dead horse for not just the next 3 years before the next general election, forever? You'll just be one of these fringe parties who rinse and repeats the same approach, but never gets the breakthrough.
Not fringe, but hopefully the party of common sense and good ideas. Look, I mean, Hartlepool is a really interesting example. It's been Labour for 60 years. They just hung on whilst much of the Red Wall collapsed last time round. And that's good. If it's closer and you've got more choice, then actually, voters. So of the 11,000 votes I got, about 75% came from Labour. You might think that's a bit odd, some bloke coming from down south, coming up to Hartlepool. But actually, people, they bought into it. They knew that they wanted Brexit to be sorted, and now you've got to focus on other ideas. Look, we're working out whether should I stand, or we've got some great local people who should stand. So we're working that out, and we'll make an announcement sometime next week. But it will be very, very interesting indeed as to which way that goes. I think the Hartlepool voters could be very interested in saying, actually, maybe we do want to change. Maybe we do want Hartlepool's voice to be heard more loudly by a different party in Westminster than just be a sort of silent part of the minority if they stick with Labour.
And again, to go back to this sort of realignment point, whether people are now voting in ways or on bases or I think you're right that people are much more promiscuous about their political parties, right? I mean, in the 50s, 60s and 70s, the typical voter voted for the same party in absolutely every election, and local elections and by-elections. That's breaking down a lot, clearly. And the Brexit Party topping the poll in the Euro elections, just straight out of a clear blue sky, is a clear sign of that. You'd hardly been in existence 5 minutes and you win a national election. But do you think a kind of tax-cutting, smaller state agenda plays well in areas like Hartlepool? The conventional wisdom, and certainly the Conservatives seem to be applying this conventional electoral wisdom to the Red Wall, is these people want more government spending, the government to invest in infrastructure there, spend more on this, spend more on that. The people there are typically lower earners. Welfare bills are higher, so we can't touch any of that. Do you think an agenda that some people might consider is kind of Thatcherism 2.0 is going to fly in these sort of areas? Maybe politics and people's attitudes have changed so much that it will.
Oh, there's absolutely no doubt at all. Voters in Hartlepool would, when they appreciate that our proposals would put an extra £30 a week into their pocket, I think they'd find that very, very interesting indeed. And that's the bedrock of what we're saying. Is we're saying, look, you can spend your money better than the government, the bloke in the bowler-hatted smart suit from Whitehall. And the thing is, you can actually, under our proposals, you can have lower taxes, more money in the pockets of the least well-off, the smaller businesses, the self-employed. You can also still do, as we touched on earlier, you can still afford the big infrastructure projects. You can still afford to invest more in the health system, subject to some serious reforms. Because actually, but as long as you spend the money wisely, that's what countries like Singapore are doing. They're getting the high growth by having a low tax take, but they're getting the investment. And so things work, amazingly. And that's, no one's put that case for a very long time here in the UK to say, actually, we can do both things. We've got to be so much more ambitious about how things, rather than just accept, oh, that's how it's always been. And it's just a sort of, there was a terrible expression in the late 70s amongst the Tory party. It was just a process of managed decline. Mm-hmm. I don't accept that at all. We've got a great opportunity. Of course, COVID's been a nightmare that, we've got to recover from. But the best way to recover from it is go for growth, big time, foot flat on the accelerator, in seventh gear in the car, but do it smartly and spend the money wisely.
Interested in how you apply your party's name and your principles of reform to the public sector and the civil service. You've mentioned this a couple of times. Perhaps we can dig a little deeper on that. Anthony Sainthill asks on the YouTube chat, after tax reform, where would Richard start on reform of the sclerotic civil service and the public sector? In terms of sort of health and education, two of the big budget items on the government balance sheet, how would you reform it? I mean, it's sort of, I can see the attraction of saying, well, we can cut taxes, that will boost growth, we'll get more revenue. Hurrah, the NHS and the state schools can have yet more money and lower ratios of teachers to pupils and all of the rest of it. But do you have anything radical in mind? Do you think the NHS should, be transformed into, I don't know, like the Dutch or the Swiss model of healthcare? Do you think we should have vouchers, a voucher system for school education, free schools everywhere, abolish the national curriculum, or get the national curriculum down to 1 page? You want to get the tax code down to 500 pages. Can't you get the national curriculum onto one side of A4, teach reading, writing, arithmetic, but don't prescribe, given that it's April and you're a 13-year-old, you now need to be on the second act of Macbeth, which is pretty much what the national curriculum presently prescribes? Or is it just sort of like my criticism of Dom Cummings, as he thought the state could be more efficient if only we got the right experts in the room, sort of state central planning with more intelligent people? I'd like to actually see the system reformed. You said that the man in the bowler hat doesn't know best. Great, let's give parents school vouchers then, rather than run education through local education authorities, no?
So I'll give you an example, and Anthony's great question. And whilst I won't sort of release all of our sort of detailed proposals, because we're working that up. But just as an ambition, for example, with the health service, look, my expression here is it's probably the most loved healthcare system in the world, but I don't think anybody claims that it is the best managed or the most efficient. And my simple says, well, I'll tell you what, folks, let's make it the best managed. Let's make it the most efficient. The way to do that is to be incredibly ambitious. Most countries, developed countries around the world, don't have waiting lists. Why do we accept waiting lists as a given, as a norm? It's so unambitious. Our simple ambition is 0 waiting lists. How do we get to 0 waiting lists? Answers on a postcard or a sheet of A4, but that's where we've got to go. We've got to be really ambitious. How do we achieve that? Take the civil service. The best example of the civil service, I've been mentioning this for some time, I believe that a Secretary of State coming into the cabinet should immediately bring in half a dozen to a dozen bright, smart people from the private sector who come in to implement and carry out the bright ideas and the wishes of the government and that Secretary of State. A bit like the American model. And yes, you can have some scrutiny committees and all that good stuff, but that's how it works in the States. And the best example of that we have just seen with Kate Bingham heading up the vaccine task force, a top person from the private sector who basically came in and whatever it was, 9-12 months, dedicated to, really sorting stuff out. And my goodness, the stories coming out. But the bottom line is that they really they made quick decisions, smart decisions, created a team of of bright people from the private sector. And I think we need a culture where you say, actually, within your lifespan, we need a culture where for 3 or 4 years, it's actually welcomed and really encouraged on your CV that if you're being successful, you come in and give time as part of your civic duty to work for the civil service. That's part of the public service culture in the States. Yes, you take a pay cut, but it's part of your civic duty. We don't have that here in the UK. In fact, at the moment, it's completely, the civil service just actively tries to resist it. The last thing they want is bright, smart people poking their head around how to make things better. So I think that Kate Bingham example is a really good example that we should hold up and say, right, how do we replicate that across the civil service? The target's great, is huge. If you say the government's spending £1 trillion a year, give or take, I think with some really bright people coming in, procuring better across a range of departments, you could easily take 4 or 5% off the total bill without affecting any frontline services at all. You'd actually make them better. That's real money.
Can I give you my answer on the postcard now about what I think is going wrong in a number of our state services? And somebody's mentioned this in the YouTube chat as well. Free service equals waiting list. We operate the National Health Service along socialist lines, essentially. It is the same, the reason that you have queues there is exactly the same economic reason why you get bumper to bumper traffic jams on the M25, which is also operated along socialist lines. There is no price mechanism. Now, the problem when you say that about healthcare is everybody panics. Oh my God, only the rich will be able to access healthcare. I would say, well, no, that's a different part of the equation. We need to make sure everybody can access healthcare. We need universal healthcare in the same way that we want everybody in Britain to be able to eat. But we don't nationalise Tesco's and get Kate Bingham to run Tesco's. We have a competitive market in supermarkets, and we try and make sure that the poorest in society, have welfare benefits, or you could have food stamps or some such like to make sure they can access it. But we don't try and get some brilliant genius like Kate Bingham to organise our supermarkets and to be the minister for supermarkets. We let the market organise it, and we ensure that people can access that market. I would like to see that happen in healthcare. The access point's vital. We want to retain universality. It seems to me that's what people like about the NHS, that everybody can get it. But that's true right across Western Europe. It's less true in America. So isn't the question to actually liberate this away from the experts and the brilliant Kate Binghams of the world and let ordinary people, rather than Kate Bingham in her bowler hat, organise everything for us?
Well, look, I mean, the reality with the health system, of course, it's free at the point of delivery. Many healthcare systems around the world are free at the point of delivery. It's just organised in a different, frankly, much more efficient way. That will always remain. But the truth is, you don't pay at the point of delivery, but we're all paying every day, every week. But because we don't really see that. One of the ideas, an interesting idea someone put to us is actually, if you knew how much, when you go and use the healthcare system, whether it's a GP appointment or a treatment in a hospital, if you actually just had almost like a sort of a credit note, I hope the treatment went well. By the way, this is the value of the treatment you've just received. You don't have to pay for it, but this is what it's cost the nation. So you want people to understand, yeah, this is real money. Whether it's 100 quid for a GP appointment, the fact that you missed it has basically sort of led to inefficiency. You've lost 50 quid's worth of someone else getting access. You just had a serious piece of surgery. The value to that, let's call it 1,500 quid. Again, people would start to realise that actually, it's not for free. But the great thing is, and the amazing thing that will always remain here in the UK is, no one has to pay. As you say, it's universal free access at the point of need, but we're all paying for it through our taxes, through our national insurance and income tax. But if there was a greater understanding of the worth of what we're receiving, that's an interesting start.
Okay. And what about schools as well then? Shouldn't we liberalise that a bit? I'd like to see much more diversity in schools. Some schools that might focus a bit more on, I don't know, music or the performing arts. The school down the road might be a bit stronger at science or sport, and you potentially mix and match a bit. I hate this 200-year-old idea that you're sort of sent to school like you're sent to a prison. Why can't you mix and match? Be at one place on a Monday and a Tuesday, somewhere else on a Wednesday. But again, shouldn't we allow entrepreneurialism and innovation to bloom here. Again, rather than hoping that we get a brilliant Secretary of State for Education, why don't we allow powers to be exercised much more locally, head teachers to set the tone and the style of their school, to decide whether they're going to, do a bit more on chemistry and perhaps a bit less on modern languages, or vice versa. Set the sector free. That would be innovation and growth, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I was very involved in the early days of the academy movement back in the mid-Blair years. And I think huge progress was made on that. And then I wrote a paper and the Conservatives did great strides bringing in free schools. And so, there has been a lot of progress. And that part of the idea of that was to create more specialisms, as you say, an academy of sport or music or science. And it has been slightly stifled by, I think, civil service targets and a lack of ambition, as you say, on the curriculum. And there are some really interesting ideas coming around. I think we're about to face an education revolution, because lots of people are going to say, well, okay, online learning has been a bit of a learning curve. And of course, we can always do things better. But the result of that is people are going to say, right, well, everybody should have iPads or laptops. And then, yeah, let's do it differently. Maybe, let's set in different configurations. I think in 10 years' time, we're going to be looking at something radically different. You've got, with the Oak Academy, I think you've got whole curriculums now online. So, some parents are going to say, well, why do I need to send my child to school at all? Well, there are very good reasons why. But these are all I think we're going to be in a fascinating education revolution. And I think you're right. We do need to free it up to more openness, more innovation. Of course, look, mistakes will be made. But I think that's where we're at. And
do you think that could revolutionise the university sector? I was basically the very last year that went to university where we were still using pen and paper. And, in order to make some half-assed effort to actually pass my degree, I would have to turn up to a drafty lecture hall, desperately try and listen to the knowledgeable words of the professor at the front, scribble them down in something approaching shorthand, and learn from that. Now you could watch the whole thing on YouTube, right?
Yeah, look, I've been one of the greatest critics of the university sector. I wrote a big report in 2017. I'm an advocate that there should be many more two-year degrees, so that, again, you come back to choice. Students should have the choice. If they want to save 15 to 20 grand, you can do that degree in 2 years, not 3. You can still have a great time. But of course, what we're seeing now, and my second son, he's 21, he's just finishing up at Leeds. He's saying, Dad, I've got no more face-to-face lectures. And he then said to me something, he said, actually, a lot of these courses now will have no lectures going forward whatsoever. They will just be online courses, at which point you ask the question, well, why am I going to some sort of first and second division universities
for a lot of money?
I'll sign up online to the £5 grand online version that Durham or Bristol or Oxford are offering. I don't need to go there at all. So I think there will be a university revolution, and I think there's going to be a big shift over the next 5 to 10 years. And some sort of mid-ranking and lower-ranking universities are going to find life very, very uncomfortable indeed.
Okay, Richard, I want to finish just on a couple of points which we've touched on a little before, but the audience is still going up on YouTube. But you can rewatch the whole thing from the start. All of it is pure gold, I guarantee that, if you've joined us late. One of them is about the Constitution. And various people have asked, what's the Reform UK stance on the Union? Do you have a positive case for retaining the Union? Again, I'm a bit betwixt and between on this. One of the things that confuses me often is some of the arguments that were used by Remainers for the both on this side of the English Channel and in mainland Europe for staying in the EU was stronger together, don't want any barriers or friction in trade, peace, stability, blah, 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 blah. A good number of the Brexiteers who opposed those sort of memes now seem to be going to exactly that playbook for the United Kingdom. Stronger together, better together, years of stability and peace together. What's your view of the Union? And do you think that at least the constituent parts of the Union should be able to decide. If Scotland wants to
so
go, then it can go, can't it?
Yeah, we're massively pro-union. We've made that very clear. We've got a leader in Scotland, Michelle Ballantyne, who came to us from the Conservatives. And our position is very clear. The reasons the union came together 300 plus years ago was actually in order to provide military security, to provide free trade and financial stability. And interestingly, 300 years later, those same three principles haven't changed one jot. But the truth is, we're all so invested together. It's a bit like a big family. And of course, occasionally, we irritate each other and we think we know best. But the truth is, we are so intertwined. Think of the human body, all the vessels and all the different moving parts. We've grown up together, previous generations, we fought and died together. And we've invested together across all the parts, whether it's in industry, whether it's in renewables, whether it's in banking. We supported each other. We supported the two Scottish banks when they got in a pickle 12 or 13 years ago. The sum of the whole of the four nations is worth so much more than the sum of the individual parts. And the expression I use is, if Scotland was to leave the union, it's a bit like chopping off one leg. It's going to be bad for the leg, and it's going to be bad for the other, for the rest of the body. And there's no question that would be the case. And actually, there's also a serious risk here. My view is actually, if Scotland were to leave, then the risks and the damage to the rest of the union are so significant. Actually, it's not a decision that is just for Scotland. It's a decision for all 67 million citizens of the UK, because it's so significant, that pain and that damage. And I don't think it's right. If there was a referendum in Scotland, it would be decided by about 1.8 million, 1.9 million people voting one way or the other. It's not right for less than 2 million people to significantly potentially damage the interests of the rest of the 65 million.
Isn't that what the EU argued about the Brexit referendum?
No, it's fundamentally different, because we've been together and intertwined for 300 years. The EU is in its current construct. We've been there since the mid-70s, but actually it's sort of morphed into something quite different in the 90s, and it's wholly different. So I do think there is if we'd been in the EU for 300 years, then it might have looked different. But I think with the union, it's fundamentally different. And what I also worry is that actually, if Scotland was on its own, then clearly financially it is smaller, and it's going to face additional risks, and that's going to present additional risks to the rest of the UK. So yes, I'm actually a great fan of pushing power as close to the people. I like devolution. Of course, mistakes are made, and we're seeing that in Scotland at the moment with the lack of separation of powers between.
And in Liverpool, it's worth saying.
And in Liverpool, and these horrors happen, but we learn from them, and we have to change them. That is democracy. But I'm a great believer in pushing more powers as close to the people as possible. So yes, let's have a big debate about the constitution, push more powers into the regions. I don't think Westminster and Whitehall know all the answers. There's some great people in the regions who would love to get more involved if they felt it would make a difference.
Richard, then let me finish on this question. I see Dan Eady in the chat said, Mark is either smoking or drinking. That's not actually true. I'm doing both. I'm smoking and drinking. And somebody's asked on the Zoom side about cannabis legalization. You've made great play of trusting individuals to lead their own lives, make their own choices. Is Reform UK going to be unambiguously against the nanny state? You might have some sort of regulations and taxes for things that actually harm people or cause costs elsewhere, but shouldn't we take a much more liberal view on what can be advertised, rather than this everything that might be potentially bad for you is now not really apparently a matter for me, it's a matter for some bureaucratic agency or Public Health England, and can't have happy hours or God knows what else. Do you think that on, if you like, traditional vices like smoking and drinking and gambling and eating hamburgers, that we've regulated these too far in terms of restricting advertising and the like? And what about what some people might consider vices which aren't presently legal? Cannabis, drugs more widely. Shouldn't that be, I'm choosing to vape and drink here. Shouldn't it be up to me whether I, snort cocaine or smoke cannabis?
So I hate the nanny state. And the two main parties stand for, for more regulation, more impositions. And, one of our big things is, we're committing that every single freedom that the government has taken from us should be given back to us, and more. I think an interesting example is e-scooters. That's going to be a really interesting one. It's just a complete pickle of regulation at the moment. You can use them on the street, but maybe not, and it's a trial period. You can't use it on the pavement. Can you wear helmets? Don't you wear helmets? All of this stuff. I actually believe in individual freedoms, and yes, you should push that ability to choose much, much more. I think the whole issue about drugs, we're sort of not allowed a proper grown-up debate about cannabis in this country. It's just like, the politicians know best. Why not actually have a proper debate? I quite like referendums, but let's organise them maybe a bit better. But let's have a debate about this. Let's try things. And so I think, we have got to trust the people and have this sort of discussion and debate and see what works. And we don't know all the answers here in the UK. We've seen it with COVID. We've seen it with a bunch of other stuff. Other nations have organised things much, much better. Australia they really do some things really much smarter than we do. So I do think we've got to look at these things. I think we've got to be prepared to think much more outside the box and slash regulations in so many ways. Let's trust the people a lot more. And it may be, for example, maybe individual cities. Why not say to cities under a city mayor, if you had a city mayor, whichever city you want to choose, who says, actually, I'm going to have a referendum in an individual city to legalize, let's say, cannabis. Why not trust the people and say, well, let's try that for 3 or 4 years? Does that reduce crime? Does that reduce the tragic knife crime and deaths and young teenagers bleeding out on our pavements? We don't know this stuff because we're not allowed to debate it. We're not allowed to trust people. We're not allowed to try it. And I don't think that's good enough.
Richard, it's been a fascinating discussion. Although I keep screaming at politicians to make sure they stick to budget, I'm hopeless at sticking to time. We've already overrun our hour by 12 minutes or so, but there was a huge amount to get through. Thank you, Richard, so much for joining us. Obviously, as an independent, non-partisan think tank, I can't wish you good luck, but I do hope that we can keep talking because I welcome all of these contributions to the national debate. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on this special In Conversation episode. And I look forward to continuing to work with Reform UK and across the political spectrum with free market ideas in future. Thanks so much, Richard. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us covering so many different topics. Really appreciate it. Thanks too to our IEA donors whose generous support helps us keep this event program running, especially in this year of economic turbulence like this one. Thanks to all of those who've watched us on YouTube. If you've enjoyed it, please give it the thumbs up. If you're not yet subscribed, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Quick advertisement for some of our upcoming events. The In Conversation series continues apace. I'll be speaking to Northern Ireland First Minister Arlene Foster at 1 p.m. on Wednesday, the 7th of April. And my colleague Christopher Snowdon, scourge of the nanny state, will be sitting down with journalist and author Matthew Said on Tuesday, the 13th of April at 6 p.m. The IEA Book Club will be hosting Professor James Tooley, Vice Chancellor of the University of Buckingham, on Tuesday, the 30th of March at 6 p.m. He'll be discussing his latest book, a topic we touched on, Really Good Schools, Global Lessons for High Caliber, Low Cost Education. To find out more about that and the IEA Book Club, please go to iea.org.uk. And if you're looking for something to do over your Easter bank holiday weekend, if you're still locked up or locked down, on Easter Monday, we're hosting a panel with the Institute for Prosperity on levelling up. The panel includes Labour councillor Brendan Chilton, a regular on my Live with Littlewood show, former Labour MP and chair of the Institute for Prosperity, Caroline Flint, and businessman John Mills. You can register for that webinar by visiting, again, the events page on the IEA website. Live with Littlewood returns as normal next Wednesday at 6 p.m. Tune in for my usual stellar mix of guests, commentary and analysis from a free market perspective. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. Thanks again to Richard Tice for being our special guest this evening. Stay safe, stay free, wherever you are. Over and out.